I paid for my son's wedding, the most joyous day I thought we'd share. But the day after, he and his new bride revealed the truth. They were never in love. They were after my money. They thought I was a fool, but they underestimated my resolve. I was humiliated, betrayed, and determined to reclaim what was mine. This is my story of betrayal and the justice that followed. The scent of lavender and vanilla filled the room as I arranged rows of small vases along the dining table. The flicker of candlelight played softly against the floral-printed curtains my mother had sewn decades ago. My son, James, had always loved those curtains. "They make this place feel like home," he would say, his hand lazily tracing patterns in the fabric. And now, as I prepared to welcome Rebecca into our family, I wanted her to feel the same warmth, the same love that this house had always radiated. "After all," she completed him, "at least, that's what he told me the day he proposed." "I'll take care of everything," I'd said when James shyly asked if I could help plan the wedding. The gratitude in his eyes made my heart swell. "Mom, are you sure? It's so much." "And Rebecca," I waved away his concerns with a laugh and a squeeze of his hand. "This is what I do, sweetheart. Let me give you both the day you deserve." It wasn't just the planner in me talking, it was the mother. My James had grown into a man, strong, capable, kind. Watching him find love was the kind of joy most parents pray for. How could I not pour my soul into making his dreams come true? The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind. My mornings began with endless phone calls, florists, caterers, venues, while my evenings ended with Rebecca curled up on my couch, scrolling through mood boards on her phone. She'd laugh as she showed me the latest must-haves for the ceremony. Her laughter was light, bubbling over like champagne, and before I knew it, I was laughing too, caught in the infectious energy of youth and promise. I told her stories of my own wedding, the dress, the jitters, the way James's father had cried when I walked down the aisle. She listened, wide-eyed, nodding eagerly as if she were collecting pieces of advice for her own journey. Rebecca was everything James could have hoped for, beautiful, poised, and charming enough to light up every room she entered. Yet, what truly endeared her to me was how she looked at my son, with a tenderness that seemed to cradle him in love. Watching them together, I couldn't help but feel proud, not just of him, but of the family we were building. It was more than I could ask for. The week before the wedding, I stole a rare quiet moment in my garden. Hydrangeas bloomed in plumes of whites and blues, their petals whispering secrets with each brush of the breeze. Kneeling in the soft earth, I nestled new bulbs into the ground. It would be fall before they bloomed, but I already imagined Rebecca and James sitting on the porch, sipping tea as the flowers danced in the wind. The thought warmed me. This wasn't just about one day, it was about planting roots for their future, for the family that was bound to grow in the years to come. The wedding came together like a symphony, each note precisely timed, harmonious, perfect. Rebecca had chosen a grand venue, the kind that shimmered in the midday sun and glowed under evening stars. I watched her pacing the bridal suite in her gown, the intricately embroidered lace gliding across the floor like liquid. She paused, catching my eye, and smiled. "Catherine," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you for all this. None of it would have been possible without you." My throat tightened, and I blinked back tears. "Just take care of my boy," I whispered, pressing her hand. "He loves you so much." The ceremony was the kind of beautiful that lingers in you, long after the day ends. James choked up as Rebecca walked toward him, and when he declared his vows, I saw every ounce of the boy who used to bring me wildflowers clutched in his muddy hands, the boy who had grown into a man who could promise forever. It was perfect. That night, as the guests danced beneath strings of fairy lights, I stood on the edge of the crowd, letting the scene soak in. Couples swayed, laughter bubbled, glasses clinked. James spun Rebecca across the floor, her dress fanning out like a weightless cloud. I felt full, not just with pride, but with the aching joy that comes when you realize you've done your part. I had given them a beginning as magical as any they could have dreamed of. But when James pulled me aside after the last song played, there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Anxiety? Maybe? Guilt? "Mom," he said, his voice quieter than I'd expected. "Can we talk tomorrow? I nodded, brushing a strand of gray-streaked hair from my face. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? He hesitated, shaking his head. It's nothing, just thank you for everything. He wrapped me in a hug then, his arm strong but his touch unsteady. I felt him tremble against me, but when I pulled back to look at him, he smiled like nothing was wrong. That night, I slept with the peace of a mother who had given all she could, convinced that I had secured happiness for those I loved most. I should have been listening, though, listening to that tiny voice tugging at the edges of my joy. Something wasn't right. I ignored it. I wanted to believe too much in the story I'd written in my head. The glow hadn't faded yet, the darkness hadn't come. It wouldn't take long, though. Tomorrow held truths I wasn't ready to hear. The following morning, I woke early, as I always did, the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen curling through the air like an embrace. The house felt unusually still, the echoes of last night's music and laughter replaced by a quiet that gnawed at me in some inexplicable way. James had asked to talk, but what about? My mind flicked through possibilities, a thank you, perhaps, or maybe some enthusiastic plan for their future. I allowed myself to indulge in the thought that he might announce plans for grandchildren one day soon. My heart swelled. I had no idea I was hours away from it breaking. James arrived alone, his car pulling into the driveway with none of the ceremony that the newly married deserved. No Rebecca. Just him, his hands shoved in his pockets as he approached the front door. I greeted him with a smile, gesturing for him to come in. Have you eaten? I can make something, I offered, already walking toward the kitchen. No, Mom, he murmured, stopping me in my tracks. I need to talk to you, now. Something in the tone of his voice, a strange weight, deliberate and flat, made my pulse quicken. I sat down across from him, suddenly uncertain, my mind spiraling into possibilities. He didn't look me in the eye immediately. Instead, he stared at his hands, his fingers squeezing and releasing as if seeking answers in the grooves of his skin. Finally, he exhaled, lifting his gaze to meet mine. Any joy I'd clung to from the wedding evaporated when I saw what was there: guilt. Mom, he began, hesitating. There's something you need to know. Something you deserve to know. The air seemed to thicken, wrapping around my chest like a tightening coil, suffocating and invisible. What is it, James? I asked, my voice unsteady for reasons I couldn't yet name. He looked away again, his jaw tightening, then loosened it with a strange, bitter laugh. 12 seconds, maybe 15, it felt like a lifetime before he spoke. Rebecca and I didn't get married because we love each other, he said, the words landing like stones in the space between us. My body stiffened, confusion knitting my brow. What are you talking about? His words poured out in a rush then, as if saying them faster might lessen the damage they would do. We thought this would be easier if you believed all that. The romance, the fairy tale. But the truth is, this was never love, Mom. Rebecca and I planned it, this whole wedding, because we needed your money. I felt the world tilt, the room spinning so sharply that I thought I might vomit. What? The word came out in barely a whisper, more breath than sound. I blinked at him, trying to process what he'd just said, hoping, no, praying that I'd misheard. Things have been hard for me, financially, he admitted, his voice teetering between defensiveness and shame. I'm in debt, Mom. A lot of it. I tried to figure it out on my own, but it just kept piling up. Rebecca. He paused, running a hand through his hair, his face twisting into a grimace. Rebecca said we should use the wedding to turn things around. I couldn't speak. My lips parted, but no words came. I just stared, the full weight of his confession pressing down on me like a lead cloak. So, what? My voice cracked. You lied? You used me, all of this, for money. My hands gestured weakly toward the house, as though it carried the burden of my efforts, my sacrifices. It's not like that, he said too quickly, his tone morphing into something defensive. I didn't know what else to do. You've always been so giving, Mom. You've never said no. I figured this was the only way you'd ever help me out of the mess I'm in. I didn't hear most of what came next. Words about Rebecca being supportive, about how they didn't plan to make it forever, how the marriage was just a logistical step to get Rebecca's name tied to our account so she could also help him rebuild. His plans, his excuses, his manipulations, none of it registered. All I could see was the boy I raised, the boy who used to climb into my lap and promise to take care of me when I got old, reduced to this stranger who had plotted against me. When my voice finally returned, it was quiet, trembling at the edges. Rebecca knew. I stopped, shaking my head as I corrected myself. Rebecca agreed to marry you so you could take my money? He looked pained for a moment, but I saw through it. His reaction didn't come from remorse, it came from being caught. We both thought this was the best solution, he admitted. She understands how hard it's been for me. She's helping me. Helping him? I laughed then, a humorless, jagged thing that broke from my chest unbidden. Helping you? Helping you steal from me, James? From your own mother? He groaned, standing abruptly and pacing to the other side of the room, his fists clenching and unclenching. It's not stealing, he snapped. You wouldn't have given it if I'd asked outright. You're always telling me to stand on my own, to figure things out. Well, this is how I figured it out. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to go back, to rip that dance floor apart and undo every penny I'd given, every moment I'd spent believing in the impossibly cruel charade they'd played out before me. But I sat frozen, my nails digging into the soft flesh of my palms, hurting myself simply to feel something other than the furious acid building in my chest. Do you even love her? I asked finally, my voice low and hollow. He stopped moving, his back to me, and the silence that followed was answer enough. He didn't. This wasn't just betrayal, it was an annihilation of everything I understood about my son, about the life I thought I'd helped shape, nurture, protect. He turned back to me then, his face softening, pleading. Mom, I'm sorry. But we're in too deep now. There's no undoing this, please, just try to understand. But I didn't understand. I couldn't. The person standing in my living room bore the face of my son, but I no longer recognized him. I wanted to yell at him to leave, to get out of my sight, but I couldn't even move. The betrayal was too vast, too suffocating. So, I just sat there as he walked out the door and drove away. It wasn't until the echo of his engine faded into silence that the tears came. They stung hot and bitter as they spilled down my cheeks, soaking into my hands. Something had shattered inside me, and as I sat there, I realized it wasn't just my trust in James or the life I imagined for him. It was something deeper, some part of me I'd never get back. The hours after James's revelation passed in a haze. I wandered aimlessly through my house, my footsteps echoing in spaces now saturated with memories tainted by betrayal. The dining room table, still adorned with the remnants of wedding preparations, soft pink ribbons, a half-empty box of candles, a dried bouquet I had planned to press for Rebecca's keepsake, mocked me with its cheerful disorder. The house felt foreign, hollowed out. Even the sunlight pouring through the floral curtains seemed cruel, too bright against the shadow that had descended around me. I replayed James's words endlessly in my mind, trying to piece together the signs I must have missed. Every detail came back tinged with suspicion. Rebecca's eagerness during the planning, the way her eyes sparkled when we discussed costs, James' sudden insistence that the guest list be expanded well beyond my initial budget. How could I have been so blind? That thought clung to me like a curse, digging deeper with every breath. Sleep didn't come, not that night nor the nights that followed. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw James as a child, his tiny hand reaching for mine as we crossed the street, his gap-toothed grin as he presented me with clumsily drawn Mother's Day cards, his whispered promises that I was the best mom in the whole wide world. I had raised him to be better than this, better than manipulation, deceit. Somewhere along the way, I'd failed. The waves of guilt crashed over me, relentless, as if I could have somehow prevented this betrayal by loving him harder or guiding him better. But no amount of self-punishment changed the truth. My own flesh and blood saw me as nothing more than a bank account. The shame seeped into every corner of my existence. Word of the wedding splendor had spread quickly through my tight-knit suburban community. Before the betrayal, it had filled me with pride to see neighbors marveling over stories of the lavish venue, the flawless decor, the the opulent feast I had orchestrated down to the last detail. Now, every whispered compliment felt like an accusation, a reminder of how thoroughly I'd been duped. The humiliation burned hotter with each passing day, especially when I caught myself smiling politely at nosy acquaintances who pried about the happy couple. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened, to admit how deeply I'd been fooled. Even in my weakest moments, though, anger simmered beneath the despair. There were days when the sadness was too heavy to bear, when I sat in my garden staring blankly at the hydrangeas, letting tears fall as they pleased. But then I think of Rebecca's smirk that day in the bridal suite or James' dismissive tone of faux apology. Slowly, my grief began to harden into something sterner, something darker. They had shattered my trust, wrecked my financial stability, and weaponized the love I had so freely given. But they had overlooked one critical thing: I wasn't weak. Not by a long shot. I started sifting through the remnants of that day, both literally and figuratively. The invoices, receipts, and messages I had clung to so proudly as tokens of the wedding's success became pieces of evidence. Pausing over a florist's bill or an email chain with Rebecca, I began noticing patterns, small but significant details I'd dismissed before. Rebecca's insistence on paying certain vendors herself, for instance. At the time, I thought nothing of it. She claimed she wanted to be involved equal to James. Now I wondered, why had she been so adamant about handling those specific payments? My instincts whispered that there was more to uncover. But digging through the ashes of betrayal wasn't easy. There were days I hated myself for caring enough to investigate, for still wanting answers when part of me screamed just to move on. Ruth, my sister and closest friend, had noticed my withdrawn demeanor and had relentlessly called, texted, and eventually shown up at my doorstep, refusing to leave until I let her in. When I finally broke down and confessed the full truth over a pot of too bitter tea, her face went pale. "That conniving little snake," Ruth hissed, the teacup shaking in her hand. "I always thought she was too polished, too perfect. No one's like that without hiding something." Her words lit a spark in me, a validation I hadn't known I needed. "I should have seen it," I murmured bitterly. "I let them do this to me, too." I faltered, catching myself before the sentence unraveled into a sob. But Ruth's hand shot across the table, gripping mine tightly. "No," she said firmly. "You didn't let them do anything. They made their choices, Catherine. And they're going to regret them. Trust me." There was a certain clarity in her tone, a raw sharpness that nudged me toward resolve. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to lean not on guilt or shame but on the idea of power, the power to stand, to push back. My pain deserved more than silent suffering. It deserved justice. When I ventured into town later that week, the whispers from neighbors didn't sting as sharply. My stride grew steadier as I reminded myself that this wasn't the end. There was a fire smoldering inside me, not dulled by the humiliation but fed by it. Ruth's words echoed in my head as I passed the artisanal bakery where I'd ordered trays of delicate pastries for the wedding. "They're going to regret it." As I looked through the window, the shop owner caught my gaze and waved cheerfully. For once, I didn't lower my head or fake a smile. I waved back, purposeful, and walked on. Piece by piece, I began assembling the framework of not only escape but resistance. My account balances were grim, but not irreparable. I could rebuild there. What mattered most now was exposing them, not to humiliate them as they humiliated me, but to ensure they never did this to anyone else. I didn't know the full scope of Rebecca's schemes yet, but her mask had slipped enough for me to suspect this wasn't her first con. That instinct would drive what came next. Pain still lurked in quiet corners of those days, the sting of seeing couples strolling hand in hand, unaware of the storms others might be weathering, or the pang of guilt that sometimes crept in no matter how illogical. But something stronger began taking root underneath, a plan. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could do something James and Rebecca hadn't expected. I could fight back. You see, betrayal has a way of eating you alive, if you let it. I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. If you've ever been broken by someone you trusted but found the strength to rise again, you'll know the storm that comes before clarity. Follow me as I begin to uncover the truth, rebuild, and fight for justice in the only way I knew how, because this wasn't just about reclaiming my life. It was about making sure they could never hurt anyone else again. Betrayal is not a single blow, it is a series of aftershocks, each one unraveling something deeper. The days had begun to stretch longer, the weight of James's confession settling into every corner of my life, and the first whispers of clarity were beginning to replace the fog of despair. But if I thought I'd already faced the worst, I was wrong. There was one more wound they had yet to deliver, one final act that would cement my resolve beyond any point of return. It began with murmurings. In a community as tightly woven as ours, whispers traveled fast, dripping like raindrops down the roots of every conversation. I'd hear it at the grocery store, in passing snippets at the post office. Rebecca and James had recently come into money, or so it seemed. They were splurging, flaunting their new life in ways so blatant it bordered on grotesque. A brand new car for James, the polished metal gleaming outside their townhouse like a sneer at my sacrifices. Lavish dinners at swanky restaurants I'd never have expected them to afford, their laughter and photos flooding social media like little trophies. Somehow, the money I had poured into giving them a day of love and joy had transformed into a weapon, not only to exploit me but to humiliate me. It wasn't just the extravagance, it was the deliberate nature of it. Rebecca had taken to hosting gatherings at their home, inviting people from the very circles that used to revolve around me. These were friends I had volunteered alongside, neighbors who once exchanged warm nods with me over fences. I heard through Ruth, who never minced words, that Rebecca had a way of steering the conversations toward me. Subtle at first, a gentle jab about how generous Catherine was, but maybe too trusting, delivered with a soft chuckle. Then, with growing boldness, she began spinning lies about my meddling in their lives, painting me as an overbearing mother-in-law who had imposed her charity on them when they would have preferred to have a simpler wedding. I could feel their betrayal stretching its reach, sullying the narrative I'd tried to reclaim. It was bad enough to face the financial ruin and heartache they had caused, but realizing that Rebecca was actively dismantling my reputation felt unbearable. Ruth's face was pale with anger when she recounted everything, the patronizing tone Rebecca used when she spoke about me, the pitying looks from mutual acquaintances who had begun to see me not as a victim, but as the architect of my own misfortune. "She wants everyone to see you as a fool, Catherine," Ruth hissed one evening over the phone as I sat, gripping the receiver so hard my knuckles ached. "She's rewriting the story so that she and James are the ones who suffered." The sheer audacity of it made my skin burn. It wasn't enough for them to take my money, to betray my love. They sought to take my dignity, my credibility, my very identity within the community I had nurtured for decades. James stood by while Rebecca spun her web of lies, silent and complicit, allowing her to poison the same people I had called neighbors and friends. If there had been any lingering hope that I could reconcile with him, that I could find a way to forgive him, it began to wither right then, shriveling under the weight of this new insult. What pushed me over the edge, though, wasn't the gossip or the flaunting of wealth. It was a photograph I found online, buried within countless others I hadn't been able to bring myself to look at before. It had been taken on the night of their wedding, toward the end of the reception. James stood beside Rebecca, their arms wrapped around each other. His tie was loosened, hers was the flush of too much champagne, and both wore wide, triumphant grins. But what caught my eye, what sent a blade of cold rage surging through me, was the way they held a piece of the wedding cake between them, lifting it playfully like a trophy. It had been a custom creation, a towering masterpiece of sugar and artistry, and on its base were edible replicas of the hydrangeas from my garden. My flowers. My labor. My love, twisted now into a symbol of their triumph over me. My breath hitched at the sight of it, the edges of the image blurring as tears filled my eyes. I thought of the countless sleepless nights I'd spent arranging every detail, the choices Rebecca had made under the guise of excitement and gratitude while secretly laughing behind my back. The lies, the sacrifices, all culminating in a picture-perfect sham. I slammed my laptop shut and clenched my fists, trembling not just from anger but from realization. This wasn't just about their betrayal anymore. This was about regaining control of my own story. I had given them everything, too much, perhaps, But that didn't mean they owned the narrative. My pain would not be their punchline. The next day, Ruth came over unannounced, as she often did when she sensed I was nearing a breaking point. "We have to stop them," I said before she could even step inside. My voice was steady, cold. Ruth's brows furrowed, then, slowly, she nodded. "What are you thinking?" she asked, though I could see in her eyes that she already knew. I spent most of the following week gathering myself, not just emotionally but mentally, preparing for what would come next. Every time I thought of backing down, of letting exhaustion pull me into its arms, I remembered that photo. That sneer on Rebecca's face, the shine of James's new car, the cruel whispers I'd overheard in the stores. I remembered what Ruth had said, "They're going to regret it." And they would, soon. The strange thing about betrayal is how it sharpens you. The pain never disappears entirely, but it crystallizes into something sharp-edged, vivid. In a way, it strips you to your core, forcing you to confront who you really are and what you're willing to do when the world takes everything from you. For weeks, I lived in that raw state of revelation, torn between despair and defiance. I'd spent too much time drowning in one and feeling the tug of the other. Slowly, I began to recognize that I was ready to stop sinking and start swimming. It began with a name, Linda. The moment her message lit up my phone screen, I felt a jolt. Linda and I had worked together years ago at an event company, back when James was still growing into baggy t-shirts and scraped knees. She was no stranger to the luxury world, nor to the gossip that swirled around it. When we reunited briefly at the wedding, I had thought little of her sly smile and even less of her offhand comment about Rebecca being familiar. At the time, I was too wrapped up in the sparkle of the day, too busy drinking from the well of my delusions. But now, Linda's words stuck with me, refusing to let go like barbs in my skin. The message was short, cryptic even. "Call me when you're ready. I think you should know who Rebecca really is." The pull was immediate, but so was the fear. Was I really ready to hear it? I let the message sit in my inbox for days, its words staring back at me like a silent challenge. It wasn't until Ruth, always the firecracker, showed up at my house, her brow furrowed with concern, that I finally cracked. "You're wasting time," she told me, sitting across the counter with her arms folded. "If Rebecca's done this before, you need to know. The longer you stay quiet, the longer she gets to keep winning." Her words landed in me like a match to kindling. That night, after pacing the hallway until I wore grooves in the floor, I finally pressed the call button and listened as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Linda answered with a kind of knowing softness in her voice, as though she'd expected this moment to come on my terms, not hers. "I was wondering when you'd call," she began, skipping the pleasantries. "I take it you're ready to hear everything?" The way she said it made my stomach twist. Even now, I wasn't sure what I was more afraid of, what she would say or what I might have to do once I heard it. "I'm ready," I answered, though the steadiness of my voice surprised even me. Over the next hour, Linda unraveled the web of Rebecca's past with a dexterity that made my breath catch. Rebecca wasn't merely greedy, she was calculated, a master manipulator who had left a trail of scorned benefactors in her wake. From a wealthy older man she had briefly married in her 20s to a handful of business acquaintances she charmed into funding her projects, her history was dotted with broken promises and empty bank accounts. None of these stories surprised me as much as they solidified what I already suspected. Rebecca had staged her life like a production, and I had unwittingly played the fool. But there was one detail, a fractured but vital piece of the puzzle, that made the hair on my arms rise. "She used to work for someone I knew," Linda explained. "A real estate investor who swore she'd drained his savings under the guise of helping him grow his assets. She had forged documents, edited contracts, things people like us wouldn't notice because we trust her too much to look too closely." "Forgery," I repeated, my voice catching on the word. The revelation hit me like ice water. My mind raced back to the wedding preparations, slicing through memories with surgical precision. The contracts Rebecca insisted on handling, the receipts she'd mysteriously misplaced, her unusually precise knowledge of the finer points of my savings when we discussed budgets. "Listen," Linda continued, her voice growing softer now, almost hesitant. "I know this is a lot, but you need to be careful. Rebecca's smart. And she doesn't hesitate to burn people who get in her way. I thanked her, though the words caught in my throat, and hung up. For long seconds I sat there, the conversation reverberating through me in waves of realization. Rebecca's game wasn't random. It was strategic, intentional. And she'd chosen me because she thought I would always look the other way, that I would forgive until there was nothing left of me to give, trapped by a mother's blind love for her son. What she hadn't accounted for, though, was how much fire lay beneath the ashes of my pain. That night, I pulled out a notebook once meant for wedding guest list and began mapping the details Linda had shared with me. I jotted notes into its pages between shaky breaths, reconstructing the timeline of Rebecca's schemes and overlaying them with what little evidence I had gathered from my own experience. It wasn't much, yet, but it was enough to reveal gaping holes in the facade Rebecca and James presented to the world. By the morning, my quiet plotting had spiraled into a raging momentum I could barely contain. I called Ruth, who arrived within an hour armed with coffee, a clipboard, and the fierce determination that only an older sister can provide. Operation Fix What James Broke is officially underway, she declared, sitting cross-legged on the floor as we sorted through mountains of evidence together. Piece by piece, we uncovered breadcrumbs that neither Rebecca nor James had covered entirely. Payments Rebecca had made to vendors suddenly seemed suspect when I cross-referenced them with the gaps in our shared accounts. An offhand comment from my lawyer during the wedding planning suddenly clicked into place, the one about how Rebecca had taken the liberty of setting up joint accounts to make the process more seamless. I hadn't questioned it then, too lost in the whirlwind of excitement, but now I could feel the layers of betrayal unfolding like a crushing weight on my chest. In the days that followed, Ruth became my greatest confidant. Every time one of us began to waver, the other would reignite the flame. "This isn't just about revenge," she reminded me one afternoon as we pored over financial statements at the kitchen table. "This is about justice, Catherine. It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else." She was right. The fury that burned in me was no longer just personal, it was a call to action, a reckoning long overdue. Rebecca had crafted an art form out of deceit, but I wasn't the same woman she had targeted 6 months ago. I was no longer naive, no longer willing to let love blind me to the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what would lead to her undoing. Revenge is a curious thing. It doesn't start as a roar, it begins as a flicker, quiet and deliberate, feeding on your pain until it becomes something uncontainable. In those early weeks, it was enough just to survive, to put one foot in front of the other as I navigated the aftermath of my son's betrayal. But now, as I sat in my kitchen, papers and notes strewn across the table, and Ruth's steady voice analyzing the timeline we'd pieced together, the flicker grew into a steady flame. It wasn't about bitterness anymore, it was about truth, justice. Making them face the cracks in the perfect facade they had so carefully constructed. The plan wasn't born all at once. It evolved, one discovery at a time. Rebecca had underestimated me, assumed, like so many had, that I was the kind of woman who turned the other cheek, fragile and forgiving to a fault. She'd seen the Catherine who had cried in silence that day James walked out, the Catherine who once drowned in the shame of being manipulated. But what Rebecca couldn't fathom was the person I had become since then. She didn't know that betrayal sharpens its victims in the cruelest, most effective ways. I started small. I called a lawyer, a man named Mark, someone Ruth had recommended after reviewing endless legal websites. He wasn't slick or flashy, but he understood betrayal, both the emotional and legal implications of it. Over a quiet lunch at a cafe far from my house, I laid everything bare. Every receipt, every suspicious transaction, and every hole in Rebecca's timeline. His quiet nods encouraged me, his questions sharp and calculated as he scribbled copious notes. At the end of our meeting, he leaned back, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're right to be suspicious," he said, his voice measured. "But if you want to gather evidence that'll hold weight, it's going to take time. We need a solid case before we make our move." Time. The word tasted bitter. Rebecca and James were out there flaunting the remnants of my trust as if nothing had happened. Every day that passed felt like another win for them. But Mark was right. If I wanted to stop them, truly stop them, I had to be patient. Revenge wasn't a sprint, it was a game of precision, of restraint. And so I set aside my impulses and focused on what I could control. Ruth became my second pair of eyes and ears. She reached out to mutual connections, subtly asking about Rebecca's background and their recent displays of wealth. The things she unearthed were small but telling, like how Rebecca had bragged to a mutual acquaintance about finally landing a comfortable life, or how James had dropped hints about an investment opportunity he was pursuing. Each breadcrumb we collected only fueled my resolve. They thought they had cornered me. They thought I was too broken to fight back. They had no idea. One night, after Ruth had gone home and the house had settled into its usual quiet, I found myself staring at the flickering flame of a single candle. The hours spent poring over evidence had left me drained, but something deeper kept me awake. I pressed a hand against the dining room table, tracing the wood grain absently, and whispered aloud, "You underestimated the wrong person." The words, though spoken to an empty room, felt like a vow. As the days stretched into weeks, I began laying traps, subtle ones, seemingly insignificant, but carefully designed to pull threads loose from the tapestry of lies Rebecca had woven. One evening, I sent her a deliberate text, not accusatory, but enough to make her hesitate. I asked about some of the vendors from the wedding, feigning confusion over certain costs, telling her I was organizing paperwork for tax purposes. Her responses were short, clipped, defensive. I could almost hear the unease crackling beneath the surface of her carefully worded messages. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Mark, too, made progress. Through quiet inquiries and legal avenues, he unearthed more of Rebecca's history, her previous aliases, the accounts she'd drained, the people she'd hurt. The pattern was undeniable. She wasn't just a manipulator, she was a career con artist. And James, my son, my own flesh and blood, had willingly aligned himself with her at the cost of everything I thought we shared. But even as the knowledge gutted me, it became fuel. Each discovery was another brick in the foundation of my plan, another step toward reclaiming the dignity they had tried to strip from me. The hardest part of this phase wasn't gathering the evidence or piecing together Rebecca's schemes, it was staying quiet. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream their sins from the rooftop, to warn the people around them who had been sucked into their orbit of lies. But I knew I couldn't rush. Timing mattered. The world wouldn't take my word alone, they needed proof, indisputable, inescapable proof. Perhaps the most poignant irony of this entire ordeal was how Rebecca and James remained oblivious. Publicly, they thrived in their roles as the picture-perfect couple, their curated smiles fooling everyone around them. They hosted dinner parties, posted glossy photos of their lavish new life, and continued to wring every ounce of credibility I once gave them. But privately, I began to catch glimpses of their unraveling. Snippets of overheard conversations through mutual acquaintances hinted at tension, Rebecca growing impatient with James's lack of ambition, James feeling stifled by Rebecca's control. They may have built this plan together, but cracks were forming. And as their foundation began to wobble, I knew I had to be ready. One night, about 2 months into my quiet investigation, Ruth and I sat in the garden, a light breeze stirring the hydrangeas. The soft sounds of summer insects hummed around us, and for a rare moment, we let the silence stretch. Finally, Ruth looked at me, her expression as resolute as ever, and said, "You've got this, Catherine. They don't even know what's coming." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in my chest. They didn't know. But they would. Soon enough. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine anymore. It was about sending a message, to them, to myself, to everyone who assumed kindness equated to weakness. I had been broken by their betrayal. I had crumbled beneath it. But piece by piece, I was rebuilding, not as the same person I was before, but as someone far sharper, far stronger. And when the moment came, I wouldn't simply confront them. I'd expose them for exactly who they were. They thought they could exploit my love and walk away without consequences. They were wrong. If you've ever been pushed to the brink by betrayal, join me as I prepare to turn the tables in a way they never saw coming. The real story is only just beginning. The devil is in the details, they say, and so was my revenge. Every sleepless night, every aching wound where trust had once filled my soul was now a reminder of what they'd stolen, but also of what I was about to take back. Ruth and I worked in near secrecy, sealing our conversations within the four walls of my home. Sometimes, I caught myself speaking in low tones, even when no one was around, as if the walls themselves could betray me. They thought I was done, beaten. But one thing about being a planner is you learn the art of preparation. They had undercut the wrong person. Legal's one side of it, Mark had reminded me during one of our follow-ups in his unassuming office. His desk was burdened with files, most of which held truths that would expose Rebecca's lies. But if you want to unravel them fully, Catherine, you'll need more than just paperwork. You'll need to get inside their circle, play their game against them. I didn't reply right away. How did you infiltrate a world that had shut a door in your face, twice bolted and barbed to ensure you couldn't claw your way back in? But Ruth, clever Ruth, was way ahead of me. It started with the gatherings. The ones Rebecca and James were hosting like clockwork, spinning their falsified fairy tale to anyone willing to sip their wine and clap at the appropriate moments. Ruth had still kept her distance from those parties, wanting to avoid suspicion at first. That was until she suggested an idea I hadn't considered, not just keeping an ear to the ground, but walking straight onto her turf. "You're joking," I muttered, staring at her across the kitchen. The flicker of candlelight between us illuminated Ruth's smirk, that determined crease in her forehead. What would even be my excuse? Begging for forgiveness? No. You're not there to plead, Catherine. You're there to assess. To gather. Ruth's voice was steady but vermilion hot, confidence streaked through each word. Rebecca doesn't know we're on to her, and James, he's so far gone in her spell he won't see reason. But you. She leaned in closer, pointing a finger to the table between us. You walk in, contrite but strong. Curious but aloof. Let her underestimate you again. The more Ruth spoke, the more I started to see the framework of what she was suggesting. There were risks, yes, plenty of them, but if there was a chance I could pull it off, then it was a risk worth taking. I needed proximity to tear down their tower. And so we began crafting an excuse, a reason that would explain my sudden reappearance in their perfect bubble. Weeks passed, and we continued to work. The most delicate part of the plan was timing. Mark had pushed forward on legal filings, quiet inquiries about Rebecca's financial dealings. My own search for evidence was meticulous, exhaustive. I combed through their social media timelines with an almost surgical precision, sifting behind the curated filters to spot inconsistencies, a shadow where their story didn't quite align. Backdated photos. Dubious tags. Hints of alliances that Rebecca had carefully hidden up until now. On a particularly restless night, I sat perched over my laptop, trying to map out connections between Rebecca's previous benefactors and the vendors I'd hired during the wedding. It was tedious, tortuous work, but then, there it was. A name I hadn't seen in years appeared on an old invoice Rebecca had coaxed me into filing directly under her guidance. I squinted closer, my heart racing. The company, a seemingly innocuous wedding supply line, had previously been linked to Rebecca's old partner in that phony real estate scam Linda had mentioned. A pattern emerged, subtle but persistent. Rebecca was a spider weaving familiar webs. She used the same vendors, connections, and aliases to prop up her schemes repeatedly. And that familiarity, I realized, may just be her downfall. The work wasn't without setbacks. James nearly caught Ruth snooping around during one of her first attempts to reconnect with him. She'd played it off cleanly, an innocent drive past his neighborhood, a wave paired with her trademark no-nonsense demeanor, but even she admitted it was too close for comfort. Did he look suspicious? I asked her once she'd rehashed the encounter for me, my stomach churning. Ruth shook her head. Suspicious? No. More like guilty. He can't even look me in the eye. Her voice was sharp, but I could see the hurt behind it. Whatever anger Ruth carried for James's betrayal, and there was a lot she still loved him, still mourned the nephew she once adored. So did I, but my love for him couldn't blunt the edges of my resolve, not anymore. Ruth's small reconnection, fumbling as it may have been, gave us an in, a chance to shift the chessboard once more. By the time Rebecca casually extended an invitation to one of her upcoming events, it felt almost too easy. "Let her believe what she wants," Ruth whispered to me as I slipped into my coat that night, my heart pounding in time with the tap of my heels against the hardwood. The bigger their trust, the harder the fall. Judging by Rebecca's apparent ease when I showed up at her door that evening, she had indeed swallowed the bait whole. I could see it in her overly bright smile as she greeted me, the subtle lift of her powdered chin as she stepped aside to let me in. To her, I must have looked desperate, humiliated but compliant. And that, ironically, gave me the upper hand. The evening stretched long, filled with the type of shallow conversations I'd grown to loathe just by association with her. But it wasn't without merit. Between polite smiles and empty compliments, I kept my ears sharp, my eyes sharper. Rebecca had grown comfortable enough to let tiny fractures show, though perhaps she underestimated the weight those cracks would carry in the right hands. On the drive home, as I sank into the driver's seat and let the cool air rush from the vents, I clicked my fingernails against the steering wheel, reflecting on the treasure trove of information I'd stumbled upon. What she hadn't realized was how much she'd revealed between the carefully chosen words. She was proud of her manipulations, drinking in the admiration of her guests like it was deserved. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a low hum vibrated behind my ribs, no longer fear or pain, but something stronger, a growing certainty. Her house of cards? It wasn't as sturdy as she believed. It was only a matter of time before I'd show her just how fragile it truly was. The days that followed the evening I infiltrated Rebecca's party were a blur of heightened tension and meticulous planning. Each piece of information I gathered, each detail Ruth and I dissected, brought us closer to the moment of truth. The plan was taking shape, but the stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was a relentless weight on my shoulders. I couldn't afford a single misstep. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I sat at my kitchen table, poring over a stack of financial records and legal documents. Mark had been a godsend, navigating the labyrinthine world of fraud and embezzlement with a precision that left me in awe. He had obtained a court order to freeze certain accounts, but we needed more, concrete evidence that Rebecca and James had acted in concert to defraud me. The documents before me were a mix of transaction records, emails, and even a few incriminating text messages. Each one was a piece of the puzzle, and together, they painted a damning picture. Ruth, ever the strategist, arrived just as I was sipping my first cup of coffee. "Good morning, Catherine," she said, her voice brisk but laced with a reassuring warmth. "Any new developments?" She took a seat next to me, her eyes scanning the papers I had spread out. "I think so," I replied, pointing to a particularly damning email from Rebecca to a vendor. "Look at this. She's discussing the split of the final payment with him, same vendor we use for the catering. She's getting a kickback, Ruth. This isn't just a one-off, it's a pattern." Ruth's face darkened. "This is gold, Catherine. It proves they've been siphoning money all along. We just need to connect it to James." I nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "I have a plan. I need you to help me set it in motion." The plan was risky, even dangerous, but it was our best shot. We needed to create a scenario where Rebecca and James would be forced to act, to reveal more of their schemes. I decided to stage a small gathering, casual, seemingly inconsequential. My pretext was a neighborhood get-together, a chance for me to reconnect with friends and neighbors. But beneath the surface, it was a trap. Ruth and I spent the next few days preparing, ensuring every detail was flawless. We invited a select group of people, some close friends, others who had attended the wedding, and a few who had seen the signs of Rebecca's manipulations but hadn't acted on them. The guest list was carefully curated, each person chosen for their potential to either provide more information or add to the tapestry of evidence. The night of the gathering, I stood by the door, greeting each guest with a smile that masked the tension coiling inside me. Rebecca and James arrived together, their presence a stark reminder of what I was fighting against. They were dressed to impress, their faces glowing with the false warmth they seemed to radiate so effortlessly. As they walked in, I felt a cold resolve settle over me. This was the moment I had been preparing for. "Catherine, you look wonderful," Rebecca said, her voice smooth as honey. She leaned in for a hug, but I kept a polite distance, my smile never wavering. Thank you for having us, James added, his eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and unease. I led them to the living room, where the other guests were mingling. The atmosphere was light, but beneath the surface, Ruth and I were working in tandem, guiding conversations and redirecting any stray topics. The first key moment came when a mutual acquaintance, Tom, brought up a recent investment opportunity he had heard about from James. Oh, yes, James said, his voice casual. It's been a great way to grow our savings. Rebecca and I have been really lucky with it. I watched Rebecca closely, her face betraying a split second of panic before she composed herself. It's all about knowing the right people, she chimed in, her smile forced. We've been fortunate to have some very generous connections. Ruth, standing nearby, caught my eye and nodded imperceptibly. This was it. The moment to strike. Speaking of generous connections, I said, my voice steady, I was looking through some old records the other day and noticed a few discrepancies. It's nothing serious, just some missing receipts from the wedding. I was hoping you could help me with that, Rebecca. It's important for my records. Rebecca's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. Of course, Catherine. I'll be happy to help. We can go over it in the kitchen, if you'd like. As we moved into the kitchen, I could feel the tension in the air. Rebecca's eyes darted around, as if looking for a way out. I closed the door behind us, ensuring privacy. Rebecca, I need to know something, I said, my voice low but firm. What's the real story with those kickbacks you've been getting? Her face paled. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. I have the emails, Rebecca. I have the text messages. I know you and James have been siphoning money from me all along. You can either tell me everything now, or I'll go to the authorities. Your choice. Rebecca's composure crumbled. James, he's the one who suggested it. He said it was the only way to get out of his debts. I was just trying to help him. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my voice steady. Help him? By stealing from his own mother? By destroying a family? You're a liar, Rebecca. And you've sunk too deep to get out now. Just then, Ruth walked in, her expression calm but resolute. Catherine, I think it's time to let the others know. They deserve to hear the truth. Rebecca's eyes widened in panic, and she made a move to leave, but I blocked her path. You're not going anywhere until we've had our say. We returned to the living room, where the guests had stopped their conversations, sensing the shift in the air. I took a deep breath, my heart racing but my resolve unshaken. Everyone, I'm afraid there's something I need to share with you. It's about what really happened with my son's wedding and the people involved. The room fell silent, and I began to speak, laying out the evidence, the lies, and the manipulations that had unfolded. I showed them the emails, the text messages, the financial records. Rebecca and James's faces were a mix of shock, anger, and desperation. James' protests were half-hearted, and Rebecca's denials sounded hollow. When I finished, the silence was heavy, but then it was broken by the voice of an older neighbor, Sarah. I knew something wasn't right, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pity. I should have said something sooner. Others began to speak up, their anger and disappointment palpable. Rebecca and James tried to defend themselves, but their words fell flat. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and one by one their supporters turned away. As the night drew to a close, the air was thick with the aftermath of betrayal. Rebecca and James were visibly shaken, their facade crumbling. They tried to salvage what they could, but it was too late. The damage was done, and the truth had finally come to light. Ruth placed a hand on my shoulder, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and empathy. You did it, Catherine. You stood up to them, and you won. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. The fight wasn't over, but we had taken a crucial step. Rebecca and James had nowhere left to hide. As I watched them leave, my heart ached, not just with the pain of their betrayal, but with the realization of what needed to be done next. This was only the beginning. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but I knew I was ready. The fire within me had grown too strong to be extinguished. I had prepared, gathered my strength, and now I was poised to deliver the final blow. The plan was set. The next move was theirs, but the outcome was mine to shape. And I was determined to see it through to the end. The days following the gathering were a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. The plan had taken shape, but the groundwork was far from complete. Rebecca and James had been exposed, their lies laid bare before the very community they had so carefully curated. But exposure was only the first step. The true test was yet to come, and I knew that the final act of justice required precision and timing. Ruth and I worked tirelessly, refining our strategy. We needed to ensure that every piece of evidence was irrefutable, every detail accounted for. Mark, our lawyer, played a crucial role, guiding us through the legal labyrinth. He had obtained additional court orders, allowing us to dig deeper into Rebecca's financial records and uncover more layers of her deception. Each new piece of evidence strengthened our case, but it also intensified the pressure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Ruth and I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents and notes. "We're close, Catherine," she said, her voice a mix of determination and exhaustion. "We just need one more piece to tie it all together." I nodded, my mind racing. "What about the real estate investments?" I asked, pointing to a stack of papers. Rebecca mentioned something about a property she claimed she bought before the wedding. It could be the missing link. Ruth's eyes lit up. "That's it. If we can prove that property was actually purchased using the money siphoned from you, it would be the nail in the coffin." We spent the next few hours combing through the records, cross-referencing dates, and tracing financial transactions. It was tedious work, but our focus never wavered. Finally, Ruth let out a triumphant exclamation. "Here it is." She slammed a document on the table, her finger jabbing at a line of text. "This property was bought just weeks before the wedding, and the funds came from an account we know Rebecca controlled. It's all connected." I felt a surge of adrenaline. This is it. This is the proof we need. The next day, I called Mark and relayed our findings. He was as excited as we were. "This is gold, Catherine. With this, we can build a solid case for fraud and embezzlement. It's not just about your personal finances anymore, it's about protecting others from falling into the same trap." But exposing Rebecca and James legally was only part of the battle. I knew that to truly reclaim my dignity, I needed to confront them publicly. I began planning a public event, one that would draw the community together, where I could reveal the truth and ensure that Rebecca and James faced the consequences of their actions. The community center, with its warm wooden floors and high ceilings, seemed the perfect venue. It was a place where I had volunteered countless hours, a place that symbolized the heart of our community. I reached out to the center's manager, explaining the nature of the event without revealing too much. To the outside world, it was a community meeting, a chance for neighbors to come together and discuss local issues. But for me, it was the stage for the final act of my plan. As the day of the event approached, my nerves grew frayed. I knew that once I stepped in front of that crowd, there would be no turning back. The stakes were high, the risks immense, but the potential for justice and closure was irresistible. On the morning of the event, I stood in front of my mirror, smoothing out the lines of my dress. I had chosen something simple yet dignified, a nod to the person I was before the betrayal, but also a symbol of the strength I had gained. Ruth stood beside me, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. "You've got this, Catherine. Remember, you're not alone in this. We're all here for you." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Ruth. I couldn't have done this without you." The community center was nearly full by the time we arrived. People chatted in small groups, their voices mingling with the soft hum of the air conditioning. I spotted several faces from the gathering, along with others who had been skeptical but were now curious to hear what I had to say. Ruth and I took our seats at the front, and the room gradually quieted. I stepped up to the podium, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Thank you all for coming today. I called this meeting to discuss something important, something that affects us all. It's a story of trust, betrayal, and the fight for justice." I began by recounting the events leading up to the wedding, the planning, the joy, and the eventual revelation of the truth. I spoke of Rebecca and James' manipulation, the lies, and the financial ruin they had caused. I showed the documents, the emails, the financial records, each piece of evidence building a compelling case. Rebecca and James, sitting in the crowd, grew increasingly agitated. James's face was red, his jaw clenched, while Rebecca's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But there was no escape. The community, which had once been their cheering squad, now turned on them, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and regret. As I continued, I felt a sense of liberation. The weight of the betrayal had been lifted, replaced by a resolve that was both fierce and unwavering. Rebecca and James have deceived us all, I said, my voice ringing with conviction. They have used their charm and manipulation to take advantage of those who trusted them. But their actions have consequences, and today, we will hold them accountable. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and angry shouts. People demanded answers, and Rebecca and James struggled to maintain their composure. James tried to stand, but Ruth, who had been watching the crowd, gestured to a group of supporters who had agreed to help maintain order. "Let Catherine finish," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. I didn't need to speak for much longer. The evidence was clear, and the community's anger was palpable. Rebecca and James were cornered, their lies unraveled, their reputation in tatters. After the meeting, Mark approached me, a grim look on his face. "We need to file the final legal documents immediately," he said. "The community's support will be crucial in ensuring that they face the full extent of the law." Ruth and I nodded, our resolve heartened by the events of the day. We spent the next few hours at Mark's office, finalizing the paperwork and ensuring that every detail was in order. By the time we emerged, the sun had set, casting a golden glow over the city. The weight of the day's event settled over me, but it was a different kind of weight, lighter, more hopeful. As we walked back to the car, Ruth placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Catherine. You've taken a stand, and you've shown them that you won't be silenced. But the fight isn't over yet. We still have more to do to ensure they face the consequences." I nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I know. But I'm ready. I'm ready to see this through to the end." The road ahead was still long, but the path was clear. Rebecca and James had underestimated me, but they had made the mistake of underestimating a mother's resolve. The final act of justice was within reach, and I was ready to deliver it. The fight for justice is a journey, and every step forward is a victory. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal and the strength of resilience, stay with me as I take the final steps to expose the truth and reclaim my life. Because this story isn't just about me, it's about the power we all have to stand up against those who seek to take advantage of us. Join me as I take the final stand. The battle is far from over, and the victory is ours to claim. The morning of the community meeting, I woke before the sun, the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla from my garden filling the air, a stark contrast to the turmoil within me. My heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. This was the day I had been preparing for, the moment I would finally confront Rebecca and James, expose their lies, and reclaim my dignity. I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection calm and resolute, a testament to the strength I had found in the crucible of betrayal. Ruth arrived early, her presence a steadying force. "You look incredible," she said, her voice warm and encouraging. "Are you ready for this?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. As ready as I'll ever be. "This is it, Ruth. No more hiding, no more fear." Today, they faced the truth. We arrived at the community center, the air thick with the energy of a crowd that knew something significant was about to unfold. People gathered in groups, their conversations hushed but animated. The room was nearly full, and I could feel the eyes on me as Ruth and I made our way to the front. Rebecca and James were already there, their faces pale and tense. James' eyes avoided mine, but Rebecca's were locked on me, a mixture of defiance and fear in their depths. The meeting began with a brief introduction from the center's manager, and then it was my turn to speak. I stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment settling around me. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice steady. "We're here to discuss something of grave importance, a story that involves trust, betrayal, and the fight for justice. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, my eyes sweeping the room, meeting the gazes of those who had once been my friends, my neighbors. This is a story about my son, James, and his wife Rebecca, I continued, my voice gaining confidence. A story that begins with a wedding, a day of joy, but ends in a web of deceit and manipulation. The room grew silent, and I could feel the collective breath of the crowd held in anticipation. I showed them the first piece of evidence, the emails that proved Rebecca's kickbacks from vendors. These emails show that Rebecca was siphoning money from the wedding budget, not just for herself, but for James as well. They were in this together, and they did it all at my expense. Rebecca's face turned red, and she opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. Save your denials, Rebecca. We have more evidence. I pulled out the financial records, the transactions that traced the money from my accounts to their joint accounts and then to the property they claimed to have purchased independently. This property, I said, holding up a document, was bought using the funds they stole from me. This is not just about a wedding, it's about a pattern of fraud and embezzlement. The crowd murmured, the atmosphere shifting from curiosity to outrage. James tried to stand, but Ruth and a few supporters kept him in place. Let Catherine finish, Ruth called out, her voice firm. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. This isn't just about money. It's about the trust we placed in them, the love we gave them, and the betrayal they returned. They thought they could fool us all, but they underestimated the strength of a mother's resolve. I showed them more evidence, the text messages, the witnesses, the legal documents. Each piece chipped away at the facade Rebecca and James had constructed. The crowd's anger was palpable, a collective realization that they had been part of a grand deception. People began to speak up, their voices rising in indignation. One of my closest friends, Sarah, stood up. I always thought something was off, she said, her voice trembling. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm so sorry, Catherine. Another neighbor, Tom, added, this is a wake-up call. We need to stand together and protect each other from people like this. Rebecca's face was a mask of fury, but her words were desperate. Catherine, you're making a huge mistake. We can work this out. We can. No, Rebecca, I interrupted, my voice cold and final. There is no working this out. You've taken too much, hurt too many. The only thing left is the truth. James, seeing the tide turning against them, tried to salvage what he could. We're sorry, Mom. We were in a difficult place, and we made a mistake. We'll make it right. I looked at him, feeling a mix of sorrow and resolve. You're right, James. You made a mistake. But the consequences of your actions cannot be undone. You've lost my trust, and with it, any chance of forgiveness. The room erupted in applause, a thunderous affirmation of the community's support. Rebecca and James were cornered, their lies unraveling before their eyes. I stepped down from the podium, the weight of the moment finally lifting. Ruth embraced me, her voice a whisper of pride. You did it, Catherine. They won't hurt anyone else. Mark, our lawyer, approached, his expression grim but determined. We need to file the final legal documents immediately. The community's support will be crucial in ensuring that they face the full extent of the law. We spent the next few hours at Mark's office, finalizing the paperwork. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. Rebecca and James were charged with fraud and embezzlement, their assets frozen, and their reputation in the community utterly destroyed. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no way for them to deny the charges. As we stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. The air felt different, lighter. The weight of the past weeks had lifted, replaced by a sense of justice and closure. Ruth and I stood together, looking out at the horizon, our reflections mirroring the determination and strength we had found in each other. I turned to her, a small smile on my face. It's done, Ruth. They'll pay for what they did. She squeezed my hand. And you've shown everyone the power of standing up for what's right. You're stronger than you ever imagined. As we walked back to the car, the weight of the day's event settled over me, but it was a different kind of weight, lighter, more hopeful. The road ahead was still long, but the path was clear. Rebecca and James had underestimated me, but they had made the mistake of underestimating a mother's resolve. The final act of justice was within reach, and I had taken the final step to ensure that justice was served. The community support was overwhelming, and the legal proceedings moved swiftly. Rebecca and James faced the full extent of the law, and their reputations were shattered. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the storm of betrayal had been replaced by a calm, resolute sense of justice. I had reclaimed my dignity, my strength, and my place in the community. But the journey was far from over. There was still healing to be done, but I was ready. I was ready to move forward, to rebuild, and to embrace the new chapter that lay ahead. The weeks following the community meeting were a storm of legal battles and public fallout. The euphoria of exposing Rebecca and James was tempered by the harsh reality of the consequences. The community, once their cheering squad, now turned their backs, their faces a mix of betrayal and relief. Rebecca and James, once the picture-perfect couple, were now pariahs, their names whispered in hushed tones of disgust and disappointment. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence Mark had compiled. Rebecca and James were charged with fraud and embezzlement, their assets frozen, and their bank accounts drained. The initial court hearings were a blur of legal jargon, but the outcome was clear: they were in deep trouble. Mark's sharp questions and strategic arguments left no room for doubt, and the judge's rulings were decisive. Rebecca's attempts to plea bargain fell flat, and James's feeble apologies were dismissed as insincere. Despite the legal victory, the personal toll was heavy. James, my own son, was now a stranger to me. The last time I saw him, he stood in the courtroom, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped. He tried to meet my gaze, but I looked away, unable to bear the sight of him. The boy I had raised, the man who once promised to take care of me, had been replaced by a figure of deceit and greed. I felt a deep, aching sorrow, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. He had chosen his path, and now he would face the consequences. Rebecca fared no better. Her mask of perfection had cracked, revealing the manipulative and calculating person she truly was. She lost her job, her social connections, and her reputation. Her once polished exterior was now tarnished, her high-class persona completely shattered. Her lawyer attempted to shift the blame to James, but the ironclad evidence was undeniable. Every court hearing, every media report, continued to expose her true colors. Her friends quickly distanced themselves, and former allies turned into indifferent onlookers. She tried to contact me, desperate for some kind of reconciliation, but my response remained firm and cold. "It's too late, Rebecca. I'm not giving you another chance." The community's reaction was swift and merciless. Neighbors no longer greeted her, business partners severed ties, and even the charities she had once supported publicly condemned her actions. Her name became the talk of the town, but no longer with envy and praise, only with anger and contempt. Her properties were seized, her bank accounts frozen, and her and James's financial situation fell into complete collapse. In the midst of all this chaos, I felt a complex kind of victory. Justice had finally been served, but the joy of winning was diluted by an unspeakable emptiness. I once thought that after exposing the truth, I would be able to find my inner peace again, but in fact, the emotional wounds were far from healed. I had lost the family I was once so proud of, lost my son's trust and respect. None of that could be easily restored. However, I did not fall into despair. Every day, I persevered, rebuilding my life. I started volunteering at the community center again and reconnected with the friends who had supported me. The community's overwhelming support was a comfort, their kindness and understanding helping me gradually step out of the shadows. I began to refocus on my career and replan my finances, ensuring I could live independently and on my own terms. Ruth was always by my side, her support my strongest shield. We spent many sleepless nights discussing future plans, mapping out a new beginning. She encouraged me to let go of the past and look forward, but she also understood my complex emotions. One time, she sat with me in the garden, and we watched the last rays of sunset fall upon the flower beds. "Catherine," she said softly, "you truly won this battle, but the real victory is that you found your own strength. You're no longer a deceived victim, but a woman with dignity and resolve. You prove that even in the darkest moments, there is always light. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. She was right. All the pain and challenges had ultimately forged me into a stronger person. I rediscovered my love for life, my contribution to the community, and my hope for the future. A few days later, I ran into Sarah at the community center, an old friend who had been suspicious but hadn't acted. She walked over, her eyes filled with both apology and admiration. "Catherine," she said, embracing me, "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. You did a very brave thing, and we will all remember your courage and determination." I smiled, a warmth spreading through my chest. "Thank you, Sarah. If more people stand up, things like this won't happen again." The community's support and understanding gradually grew into a powerful force that helped me rebuild the foundations of my life. I began to participate in more community events, reestablish relationships with my neighbors, and restore my faith in life. Every interaction, every conversation, was a reminder that although I had suffered a great loss, I had also gained new strength and hope. However, I knew this fight wasn't completely over. Rebecca and James might continue to try and salvage their reputations, might seek various ways to evade legal punishment. But I was no longer afraid. I was no longer a person who could be easily deceived and manipulated. I had the evidence, the community's support, and my own inner strength. One night, I sat at my desk, looking through the organized evidence and legal documents. Every page recorded their betrayal and my struggle. I knew these documents were not just legal evidence, they were a symbol of my inner strength, proof that I had risen from the pain. I took a deep breath, feeling my resolve harden. Rebecca and James's downfall was a scar on my life, but it was also a chance for a rebirth. I would not let them affect my life anymore, would not let them take away my dignity. I would continue to move forward, to rebuild my life, because I had found my own strength and courage. The road ahead was long, but I was ready. The storm had passed, and the dawn of a new chapter was on the horizon. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my place in the community. The battle was far from over, but the victory was mine to shape. This was my story of betrayal and the justice that followed. A story of pain, resilience, and the unyielding strength of a mother's resolve. The days that followed the legal proceedings were a blur of media attention and whispered conversations, the community's reaction a mix of shock and vindication. I found myself at the center of a storm I had never sought, but one I had weathered with a resilience I never knew I possessed. The once whispered doubts about my judgment had given way to a groundswell of support and admiration. My neighbors, friends, and even those who had once been skeptical now saw me as a symbol of strength and justice. Ruth and I often sat in the garden, the same garden where I had once imagined Rebecca and James sipping tea as the hydrangeas danced in the wind. Now, the flowers were a different kind of symbol, a reminder of the beauty that can still bloom even after the harshest winters. Ruth's presence was a constant source of comfort, her unwavering support a balm to my soul. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Ruth turned to me with a soft smile. "You've done it, Catherine. You've not only exposed the truth but have also shown the community that you are stronger than they ever imagined." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief and a glimmer of hope. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ruth. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." Ruth squeezed my hand. "You've always been strong, Catherine. This just brought it to the surface." The legal battles were arduous, but the final verdict was definitive. Rebecca and James were found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. The judges' sentences were harsh, reflecting the severity of their crimes. Rebecca received a significant prison term, and James, though his sentence was slightly less severe, was still facing years behind bars. Their assets were seized, and their financial stability was irreparably damaged. The community, which had once been their audience, had become their judge. The local media covered the story extensively, and the public outcry was swift and resounding. People who had once admired Rebecca and James for their seemingly perfect life now expressed a mix of anger and disappointment. The social media platforms that had once been filled with their curated posts were now filled with messages of support for me. The contrast was stark, and it was a powerful reminder that truth, no matter how painful, always has a way of prevails. But the victory, while sweet, was bittersweet. The emotional toll of the betrayal and the subsequent fight for justice had left deep scars. I had reclaimed my dignity and my place in the community, but the relationship with my son was irreparably broken. There were moments when the pain of that loss felt almost unbearable, but I found solace in the knowledge that I had acted to protect myself and others from falling victim to their manipulation. One afternoon, a few months after the final verdict, I received a letter from James. It was a simple, handwritten note, the penmanship shaky and uncertain. "Mom," it began, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what I've done. I made a terrible mistake, and I've paid the price. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me one day. Your son, James." I read the letter several times, my heart aching with a mix of emotions. I felt a pang of sympathy for the boy he once was, but the man he had become was a stranger to me. Forgiveness was a complex emotion, one that I wasn't ready to grant. I placed the letter in a drawer, a symbol of a chapter that had closed but would never be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I returned to my work as an event planner, but with a new perspective. I no longer saw my job as just about creating beautiful moments. It was about bringing people together, fostering connections, and building genuine, trustworthy relationships. My clients knew my story, and many reached out to offer their support and encouragement. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a deep satisfaction in knowing that I could still make a positive difference in people's lives. The community rallied around me in ways that were both humbling and empowering. Neighbors who had once been distant now stopped by to check on me, bringing homemade meals and offering heartfelt words of support. Old friends reconnected, and new ones were made. I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in years, a sense that I was part of something larger and more meaningful than the pain of the past. One of the most significant changes was in my relationship with Ruth. Our bond, already strong, had deepened through the trials we had faced together. She became more than just my sister, she was my confidant, my partner in every sense. We spent countless hours talking, laughing, and planning for the future. Ruth's unwavering support had been a lifeline, and I was grateful every day for her presence in my life. I also began to focus on my own personal growth. I enrolled in a few classes, exploring new hobbies and interests that I had never had the time or energy for before. I started writing, journaling about my experiences and the lessons I had learned. It was therapeutic, a way to process the emotions and reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. I even began sharing some of my writing with a small group of friends, and the positive feedback was encouraging. One of the most profound realizations I had during this time was that the person I had become was stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The betrayal had been a crucible, and I had emerged from it with a clarity of purpose and a determination that I had never known before. I was no longer the naive, trusting woman who had been so easily manipulated. I was a woman who had faced her deepest fears and come out the other side. The community support continued to grow, and I found myself in a position to give back in new and meaningful ways. I started a support group for people who had faced similar betrayals, a safe space where they could share their stories and find the strength to move forward. The group grew quickly, and the impact was profound. People who had felt isolated and alone found a community of understanding and empathy. It was a small but significant step toward healing, and it gave me a sense of purpose that I had been missing. One evening, as the community center's lights dimmed and the last of the group's members filed out, I sat alone in the room, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led me to a place of strength and empowerment. I had faced my demons, and I had won. The victory was not just for me, but for anyone who had ever felt betrayed and believed that they were alone. As I stood to leave, I felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. The future was uncertain, but I was ready to face it head-on. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my place in the community. The battle was far from over, but the victory was mine to shape. If you've been moved by this story of betrayal and the strength of a mother's resolve, please consider subscribing to support more content like this. Share your thoughts and let me know how this story resonated with you. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and if you found this video through a friend or social media, I'd love to hear where you first heard about it. Your support means the world to me.